All right, we do appreciate Fox's Morgan Mackay for bringing us that story. Again, taking another live look there at the White House. So, as we know, President-elect Donald Trump will not go to jail or face any other punishment for these criminal convictions that are stemming from the hush money trial that are now going to be paid to Stormy Daniels. And just to help us make a little bit more sense of this, I want to bring in friend to the program, Neama Rahmani, attorney Neama Rahmani. Neama, thanks so much for being with us. What are your initial thoughts? Obviously, so much of the world has been watching and waiting for this moment to find out what would happen when he was finally sentenced. What are your sentiments?
Well, Christina, today was a historic day, the first time a former president has been convicted of any crime. And it's not the jury verdict that results in the conviction, it's today's sentencing when that judgment of conviction is entered. So Donald Trump is indeed a convicted felon. Obviously, somewhat anticlimactic because Judge Juan Merchan tipped his hand and said that the sentence would be an unconditional discharge, which really means no sentence at all. No incarceration, no fine, no probation. Nor would a sentence make any sense because the judge could not enforce any type of sentence against a sitting president anyway. But what this does do is now trigger the timeline for Trump to appeal. And I think he will certainly appeal and try to get this conviction overturned. Of course, his lawyers wanted to stay or put the proceedings on hold before that conviction was entered and was final. But the Supreme Court yesterday evening, in a very close decision, decided not to intervene.
And so, Neema, it's effective that because his inauguration is just 10 days away, that's sort of the reason that the judge went this route. But you're still saying this is a historic moment because a sitting president or former president has never been convicted of a crime like this.
No, and they have not. And under the Constitution, it really doesn't matter. A president can be a convicted felon. Theoretically, a president could be president from prison. The only requirements in the Constitution or that the president be born in the United States and be at least 35 years old. But there's nothing in there about a felony conviction. So, obviously the American voters, notwithstanding this conviction, they voted Donald Trump into office and voted him overwhelmingly. But let's not forget, this conduct all took place before Trump was president the first time. This is during the 2016 campaign. And we know that the Supreme Court's presidential immunity ruling was very broad, but it doesn't touch upon conduct before someone is president. And generally speaking, campaigning, that falls outside the official duties of a president. And that's why at least Judge Juan Merchan said they were not official acts in this case.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. Of course, we did hear from the president-elect today. He was in court. He spoke for roughly 6 minutes, but he called this case a weaponization of government and an embarrassment to New York, while simultaneously maintaining that he did not commit any crime. What are your thoughts on this? And ultimately, at this point, he's still been sentenced, so it doesn't really matter.
Well, a lot of folks agree with President-elect Trump. These weren't very serious charges. They were rejected by the feds. They were rejected by Alvin Bragg's predecessor, Cyrus Vance Jr., when he was Manhattan DA. Obviously, Alvin Bragg brought the charges and got them across the finish line, which is a prosecutor's job to prosecute cases and to win them. And he was able to win this case in a way that Jack Smith and Fani Willis were not. But comparing this case to the others, it was by far and away the least serious. Trump has an argument, probably a good one, that these should have just been misdemeanors and not felonies. And certainly even as Class C felonies under New York law, these are the least serious felonies. So someone with no criminal history like Donald Trump was probably likely facing a fine and probation anyway. So the question was it all worth it when it was all said and done to spend all this time and money prosecuting this case when frankly it resulted in no sentence and the American people didn't really care about it when they went to the ballot box in November. So I think Trump and his supporters do have a good argument there. And they also have some good arguments on appeal related to presidential immunity. So there's still a good chance that this conviction gets overturned.
That's exactly what I was going to go to next, Neema. We do know that initially the judge could have sentenced him to up to 4 years in prison, although we already knew on the front end that wasn't going to happen. What role, though, does presidential immunity play out for the potential, especially as you're mentioning those appeals that are coming down the line?
Like you said, Christina, practically speaking, there was never a scenario where Donald Trump was going to be sentenced to any time. Even if he lost to Kamala Harris in November, you can't put a former president in Rikers Island with Secret Service protection. It just does not make any sense whatsoever. But now we're looking at those appeals, and Trump really has three bites at the apple. First, the appellate division of the Supreme Court there in New York, then the New York Court of Appeal, which is that state's version of their Supreme Court, and of course the US Supreme Court, because this is a federal constitutional issue. And presidential immunity, we know because of the Supreme Court's majority opinion last year that it is very broad. It covers anything that's an official act. But importantly, evidence of official acts can't even come into the trial. And Trump's argument is, well, a lot of the evidence that came into that hush money case related to when he was in office, when he was actually president. His communications with Hope Hicks, for instance, when she was communications director, or tweets about Michael Cohen when he was president. So I think he has a pretty favorable audience in the US Supreme Court. Obviously, we know there's a 6-3 conservative majority, but importantly, four of the justices were willing to grant the extraordinary remedy of an emergency appeal, which never happens. Normally, if you're a criminal defendant in state court, you have to exhaust your state appeals first. Well, Trump hadn't done that, of course. Before the justices were going to allow him to bypass that process and go straight to the Supreme Court. So I think he's got a good chance of getting this overturned if and when this case gets to the Supreme Court, because again, presidential immunity is very broad.
And lastly, Neema, before I let you go, I have to ask you about some of the other cases that, of course, we know the former president is facing. You mentioned them briefly, but we know that special counsel Jack Smith closed out the federal prosecutions over Trump's handling of classified documents and his efforts to overturn the 2020 election loss to Biden. And also that state level Georgia election interference case is still locked in uncertainty after prosecutor Fani Willis was removed from it. What do you expect from the future once Trump does take office to happen in those cases as well?
I think Jack Smith's cases have to be dismissed. He's already begun that process. Really, the only question there is, does the special counsel's report become public? There's going to be no prosecution. It's well established that a sitting president can't be prosecuted. And with respect to Atlanta DA Fani Willis, she should really see the writing on the wall as well. The same legal reasoning and logic applies to her. She's been disqualified from her case because of her own personal misconduct and hiring her boyfriend, Nathan Wade. But that case should also be dismissed. Now, there are co defendants in both the cases in South Florida. Obviously, Judge Cannon dismissed that case because she ruled that Smith's appointment was unconstitutional. But there are a lot of co defendants there in Fulton County. So the question is, what is going to happen to them? But there's no question that Donald Trump cannot be prosecuted, and all the other criminal cases have to go away.
Certainly a story that we're going to continue to follow here on Live Now from Fox. Again, thanks to our friend to the program, Neama Rahmani, for joining us to break down all the legality of the situation. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Christina.